Hello. Hello. We're starting. Good morning. My name is Alejandro Panizza. I form part of the development team of ArtEdge. And I'm going to be telling you about services management and mediation, tools for exposing your business both in Genexus and in general. To give you an idea, web services are using a technology that is very well established, and they appeared almost 20 years ago. This is a journal from 2002. At that time, web services were going to be revolutionary. It's true. It was something that was very, very useful for communications among services. For people of my age and older, you can say, well, how old we are. This is, and for the younger ones, I have to explain that this wasn't a web page, but a journal in paper. Well, at that time, the idea was to standardize the communication among devices through the web. So that they could, in order to communicate to different apps, you have to define the format, the rules of the communication, how the client was going to find the service. I mean, many things. All those rules and formats and the metadata to provide the service is known as a protocol. Web protocols, web service protocols, well, the first one that appeared, the better known, is SOAP, which is quite known. It started with Microsoft. The advantage is that it's very complete. There are many features and support, security, all kinds of cases that have already been thought out. So it's a full protocol, but since it was very complete, it was also very complex. There were very many problems at the beginning, mainly to implement the compatibility among different SOP protocols. As a reaction, we had another series of protocols called REST, which were exactly the opposite. It was a very simple protocol based on JSON, which is a text format that is much lighter, and on top of that, you had nothing specific for security, nothing as to how to discover the service. You knew the service was there and you would use it. Now, in the following years, there was a whole wave of protocols that are now in vogue, and the first one is OpenAPI, which Armin mentioned in his previous talk. It's an attempt to provide the REST with everything that the SOAP had, that is metadata, to try and discover the service, and to try and document the protocol to be able to consume it more easily. OpenAPI is implemented into Nexus. It's working well. We are in version 3. The next protocol is called OData. Now, OData is a sort of REST-style protocol, but it's different because it was on top of the ORL. It's a query system. It's a way of making queries to a predefined scheme. And if you look at the URL that you have there in the presentation, you will see that there are all kinds of operations, of operators. It's almost the same sequence of SQL on top of the URL REST. This type of service is highly useful, particularly when you know the data base and you work directly on it. Now the trouble is that the implementation from the server side isn't that easy. You've got security issues. You have, what you have to know what you put in and what you don't, and so on. And the third protocol that I wanted to share with you is GraphQL. This is a protocol we've been studying, and it's basically similar to OData, but it has a structure behind it, and it's a bit more efficient because it allows you from the customer side to say what you're going to consult and what fields you want, what data you want, and what conditions. And the way of consulting is very easy. Again, the same problem with OData, that is the implementation from the server side isn't that easy. It's a bit more complex. Now, that's the state of the art at present. Now, what's coming next in the near future? Well, the first interesting protocol is the async API. This is what Armin said in his previous talk. It's the question of publishing and subscribing turned into a web protocol. It's an evolution, if you want, of the OData, where you have support for asynchronous calls. You subscribe to a consultation and you wait for the answer. And while it's being processed, you don't have to wait. You're going to be notified through a mechanism to see when the answer is ready. We've been looking at this protocol very carefully, but nothing is done yet. It's something that we're interested a lot in. The next protocol that is also being analyzed is a binary one. I mean, all these protocols that I've mentioned so far are based on text. These are based on Mars, HTML, or JSON, or that's that type of format. But people say, why are we going to be sending out texts if it's easier if we do it, if we send out a binary? Well, it's been tried out with protocols such as Corba. This protocol existed, has existed for quite some time. It's had a very short life because it really didn't take off. But you would encapsulate Java objects, you turn them into binary ones, and you transfer them to another system run on Java, but not necessarily with the same operating system. At present, we're going back on the same idea. As Nicolas said in his talk, this swinging of the pendulum, you go on one thing and then you go back on the other thing. It's a bit improved. The protocol is called gRPG, is based on HTTP2, the new standard. It's optimized binary. Transport is binary. All data are binary, and they are based on protocol buffers. Protocol buffers are files that describe what the format of the data is going to be like. And here there is an example. Look at a protocol buffer here. You write the message of the request, then the answer, and then how you go into the service. Now, based on this type of files, there are tools generating the code for each platform, and they allow communication via web services. To sum up then, this question of protocols are evolving. They change, they improve, they take things that were bad from the previous protocol and they find out solutions. And now what we are doing at Genexus is following that evolution little by little. We follow each one of those protocols, and when we think they are mature to be used, we include them in our platform. However, the concept of what you want to do is always the same. What you want to do is to communicate two different systems that are heterogeneous through the web. I mean, that's the goal of all protocols. To that end, we think that it's all right for protocols. We are covered. Most protocols are in our short-term horizons. Others have been implemented. And what is it that we want to do? What's our next step if protocols have already been managed? All right, what we want to do is to improve the design. We want to see how we can help you to design your apps based on web services in an easier manner, in a more organized manner. And that's where APIs come in. The traditional way of building an API was one layer of web services exposed to different customers with their own particular needs, and then another layer where you have programs implementing those APIs. They could be called procedures, data providers, whatever you want to call it. But then, here we start having problems. What are the main problems of this type of architecture? Well, the first problem is how to define them. How can I define a web service? In GeneXus, I say, well, all right, I'm going to expose this procedure as REST or SOAP, and that procedure is public. It can be called by anyone or not. So I have to go and see how I manage that. How do I know what I'm publishing? How can I give it security, access, and so on? This gives me a coupling between implementation, which is what I've done, and what I've published. Now, what happens if I have to change the implementation for a certain reason? All right, I break up the service for the consumer, or I have to set up a parallel version. I have to duplicate the code. What happens if I have to set up a new version? If a new requirement is asked for, then I'll have to give version 2. What do I do? Would I give another password? Do I have a service that is called the same way, but there is an extra parameter? I don't know. There are 1,000 ways, ad hoc manners of doing it. So basically, web services problems refer to organization and maintenance. So a solution that is quite interesting, and it's the one we'd like to implement. It's called API mediation. Now, what's that? Well, it's to take this, which is the present implementation, and you put a layer in between, which is called mediation layer. And it's also known as API expedient layer, or there are many other names. And the idea is that everything that is not a part of the implementation or part of the API will go there in the middle. For example, what Armin was saying about observability, security, logo, things that are not part of the implementation of the service, but they are necessary. And I'm not affecting the definition of the web API. The web API goes on being the same. So what we would like to include in that mediation layer, for instance, is we would like to limit traffic. If I've got a service that I would like someone to use it, but not that X number of times per day or X number of calls per day. You know, when it's a simple coupling between implementation and the API, and I would like to decouple it. So I've got a parameter, for instance, that I change in my implementation, but I'd like to keep it in the API. All right, I'll transform it. And I go on calling the same previous implementation. The question of billing, if my business is API, I have to collect. Where do I keep the collect logo? For instance, analytical services of cloud providers. How do I keep the log? How do I know the number of calls and what's my response time? And also security, calls to GAM, emission of tokens, and so on. So what's the idea of this implementation that we'll have? All right, the idea is that if we go back to the topic of this event, which is to raise the abstraction level of what we define, we're going to have a definition of APIs that is going to be relative. It's going to be abstract, number two, and it's not going to depend on the implementation at all or of the platform. And number three, it's going to be textual, because we want to have editors that are going to be text-based, because we think they're more efficient, independent of the fact that we could do something graphic on top, which could be easier for observability. But in principle, it's going to be textual. So we're going to have a service that is going to be declared and an implementation, and they are both going to be separated. We're going to call this API object. It's an object that GeneXus will have, and it's going to define an interface of service, and it's going to make a reference of the implementation. And all properties and features of the service will go in the API object, not in the procedure, in the data provider, or whatever implements that call. Now, this new object, let's look at a short example of what it would look like. The idea is to have something like this. And here, this is a very simple API, and it would say, well, all right, the orders, this is the number of the service, and this is the implementation. And this is a group of services, an API that I have grouped. This grouped API, well, I can make a full deploy of it. I can change a property and say, I want to make it SOAP, or I want to make it REST, or I want it to be both. Or, I don't know, I want to make it private. I mean, whatever I can do with a GeneXus object, I can do with this API, and it affects all components. Here, the call is the same as the API. This is the present situation in GeneXus. Whenever I publish an object, the name is the same. But I can change it and say, I don't like that name. The public name is this one. The private name is the private name. And there, I'm separating and decoupling the service from the implementation. And I could even do better things, funnier things. The implementation sort of parameter that I'm not going to use it, I put 0, and it's not appearing in the service. And the order of parameters may not be the same. If I want to do it like that, I'll do it like that, and implementation is separated. Or even something that is even more interesting, I can make transformations, and the customer cloud includes the SCI of the person who is making the call for the service. And here I can do anything, or whatever I want. Things that are far more interesting. This is a very simple example. This is as far as the new object. Now, something else that I was saying today, everything that I touch affects the entire API. It's not SOAP. That's the name. That's where the services are. And many other things. All these properties are properties of the API object. It's of all objects. What's the roadmap moving forward for this object? You're going to ask me when it's going to be ready. Well, now we have the definition, we have the mapping. We'd like to have the management, that is everything that has to do with properties and configuration and deployment, to send only one API as you do with a move object or property object. And once we have that, we'll release a beta.
Iteración, queremos agregar.
In the next iteration, we'll add other things, which is impact. That's interesting. And the idea there is to have an API. I'm going to make a change, whatever change I want. And I'm going to have an impact of that API in relation to the previous version. As I do that with my database. I've got my new API, and you said, well, okay, you've touched this and that and that, and I'm going to apply the compatibility with what you're using. And there, I'll have some options. I'll go back in my change, I break my compatibility, or I make any of these transformations I've shown you to keep the compatibility in spite of having made a change. All right? And the other thing has to do with versions. We have versions in GeneXus already, but we would like to link API's version and the version because whenever I create a new version of API, I would set up a new path, or I would have policies that will allow me to make deployments of the same API without accepting those that are already working. And the last issue, the last aspect, is the question of events, things that are going to be done before implementation. If I want to transform data, if I want to do a login, if I want to record or check security, all that is going to be under events that are going to be executed before the calls. So this roughly is how this object will evolve in the short term. Very well. And then deployment to gateways. The other thing we'd like to do is to make a deployment. We've already got it for services, but I would like to do it directly with the API. So we'd like to make a deployment to Amazon and Microsoft clouds to the API, and we can generate all the necessary configuration files to be able to make that deployment. And both Amazon and Microsoft can provide us with statistics of the API use, token management, and so on, done by them in the cloud. This is what we've talked about. And now, to conclude, I'm going to give you some links. There are some interesting articles about APIs. You can see how Azure is working, and Amazon API Gateway is the two services I would like to look into. In the short term, we'd like to have at GeneXus in our own cloud one of these services as an alternative, rather, so that we can do some testing about how to make an API deployment and have all the statistics and so on. This is all. In case you have any questions, I'm available. Thank you. I'm sorry, I haven't got the question. It's one of the, I think the question is about the date when it's going to be released, and it's going to be one of the betas of this year. As we said last year, we haven't got releases, continuous releases, but every 2 months, and as we go about in those 2 months, we'll release it when it's ready. The first thing we're going to release is the definition and the management, that it's practically there. It's probably going to come out this year, and then we're going to have the rest of the features. Very well. Thank you.